This is chat 5 of the introduction, and I want to deal with some history here. You know, previously I've dealt with Emil Kraepelin, who developed the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, which in our time has been wed with medical facilities, insurance companies, and pharmaceutical companies. So this is a major branch of so-called psychotherapy, with the idea that a person will probably receive drugs when coming in with that person, a happy pill or whatever. And of course, in some conditions, chemicals do help. And then I also dealt with Sigmund Freud, who began talk therapy, and how that has continued on in our time. Now I want to deal with Eric Berne. He was born Bernstein in Montreal, Canada. And Eric Berne introduced a lot of ideas that have been very beneficial for people. For one thing, he introduced humor. I recall when I first heard about him, I was reading about what psychiatrists were most helpful in the state of California in terms of Korean War veterans, and Eric Berne was by far the most effective. And he did very weird things, like he'd come in, he'd put his hand on the back of a couch, and he would vault over into a couch. Now if you contrast this with the old psychoanalytic ways, it's dramatically different. He was showing humor, but he was showing the realness, the authenticity of being a fellow human being. And he would make jokes, call the veterans girls. He did whatever he did, but it was a loving, human approach rather than a strict antiseptic sitting on at a desk or behind the person in a chair taking notes. Eric Berne, he became Berne in the late 50s because his mother was a journalist, his father was a doctor. His mother told him to not go a single day without writing before he goes to bed. And his journalism was very humorous. And he wrote Games People Play in 1964, and he believed that the name Bernstein would cause some bias, and so he changed it to Berne, and he was quite right in that that was the first popular bestseller. Now, Eric Berne introduced a lot of right brain techniques rather than the old cold, analytical, sober, serious way of approaching therapy. My wife and I both became transactional analysts, and after 3 years of training, my wife did it in 2 and I did it in 3. But we did a lot of learning about depth psychotherapy in terms of developmental ages. Like, what result does it have if a person had a terrifically horrible birth into life? What a trauma at that age, how does it later affect somebody? How does it affect somebody if they were a premature born child? How does it affect them if the parents in a very early age do something like just utterly neglect them, do not hold them, do not rock them, just put them on a couch or in a bed and let the kid just survive, feeds them improperly. There's a lot of ugly stories that my wife and I encountered across the year, and I won't be telling those. But right now under Berne system, you get to be very developmentally smart. And you also learn various right brain techniques. In our training, we learned the techniques of Friedrich Perls, who was another psychoanalytic person who began to develop absolutely new therapeutic tactics. There's one other part of Eric Berne that I want to point out because I think it is critical to understand people. Yes, here it is. Functional analysis. Functional analysis says how it feels inside of a person's head and what can be done in terms of human personality. Sigmund Freud dealt with just critical parent or superego, the adult or ego, and then the adapted child. Berne added nurturing parent and natural child. And this means that in psychotherapy, we don't just sit analytically and soberly and try and convince people of reason. Rather, we do techniques that involve nurturing, like my wife and I did group therapy, and frequently she would hold some people in a rocking, loving, nurturing manner. Now, we also knew that the natural child was important to free people up, to liberate them. And so we would send them to playgrounds to copy children and get ingrained in their bodies once again the just sheer joy of play. So this functional analysis is something that is very, very critical because it moves us beyond the sobriety of the older Freudian system and moves us into an area of love and delight in life. Now, I'm going to end my talk on Eric Berne by one other feature, and that is that he wrote books on group therapy, and my wife and I focused on group therapy because while we were dealing with 8 to 10 people, we may be talking with a person over here in a reasonable manner, but other people in the group are listening, and we could see they were learning in the process of us dealing with that one person. Group therapy is a marvelous tool because it goes beyond some of the resistances, the way a person will try and rationalize their way out of changing their lives. Group therapy is a beautiful way to go, and Eric Berne introduced vast amounts of help in terms of group therapy. So this ends the 5th lecture.